everyone. Welcome to the EarthRise podcast, number 93. I'm Derek Barris. I've been working on a book on psychedelic therapy for a number of months. I hoped it would be done by now, but books tend to write themselves. As I was writing, I realized that if I wanted to discuss why psychedelics are beneficial for mental health, I have to look at current mental health treatments and figure out why they're not working. We have more people than ever before on antidepressants right now. Yet rates of depression and anxiety are continuing to skyrocket, pandemic aside. If the current interventions were working, that would not be the case. Any serious investigation of health brings you back to Hippocrates, who, despite having lived 2,400 years ago, got a lot right. For example, the Hippocratic school taught that diseases were not the result of divine forces, but it had to do with the body and the body's interaction with the environment. At the time, disease was thought to have one of four causes called the humors, and while humoral theory was abandoned with the advent of germ theory, Hippocrates was on to something. Now, as a scholar, Roy Porter writes in his book Madness, the four vitality-sustaining juices were blood, choler, or yellow bile, phlegm, and black bile, or what he refers to as melancholy. Now think about that. You had readily recognizable liquids in the body, such as blood and phlegm, which were attributed to causing disease. They thought black bile was secreted by the liver, but its very name was melancholy. That's because they knew that depression is a natural part of existence, not, as it is espoused today, a chemical imbalance that necessarily needs to be treated pharmacologically. Now, treated, yes, certainly, and pharmacology wasn't available to the degree that it was in Hippocrates' time, but if you're going to address depression, would you alter the brain's production of serotonin, or would you look into the environment? Now, while I've been doing all this research for the book, I keep running into support groups online for people recovering from the chronic long-term effects of a variety of antidepressants and benzodiazepines. The list of chronic conditions, such as permanent central nervous system damage and memory and motor problems, is quite startling. People are put on these drugs, or often a cocktail of drugs, with no informed consent. They're not told the long-term effects because the doctors don't know what the long-term effects are because the pharmaceutical companies aren't required to study them. Sometimes drugs are put on the market in as little as 4 weeks of research in some of these studies. Now, given the prevalence of antidepressants in our culture, 15.5 million Americans have been taking antidepressants for at least 5 years. Now, again, these drugs are only studied over short-term intervals for 8-12 weeks, and yet people are on them for over 5 years. So we've just taken it as truth that these drugs are the proper treatment for anxiety and depression. Now, considering the mounting evidence against the lack of efficacy in a majority of consumers and the lack of long-term studies on how these substances affect us, this narrative of the pharmacological treatment of anxiety and depression really needs to be questioned. Take Angela Peacock, one of my guests today. Angela is an Army veteran featured in the new documentary Medicating Normal, which is the focus of this podcast. And after suffering PTSD, Angela was put on a pharmacological cocktail of, ready, 18 drugs. Now, she's been drug-free for over 4 years and is an advocate for educating the public on the dangers of benzodiazepines and other pharmacological interventions. And as you'll hear during our talk, she is currently living in her RV as she travels around the country speaking out on these topics. She has dedicated her life to helping people recover from the drugs that are supposed to be helping them. Angela is one of the subjects of Medicating Normal. She's joined by director and producer Wendy Ratfcliffe. Wendy has been involved in regenerative agriculture and alternative education for 2 decades. And she has a BA in history from Yale, an MBA from Duke, and a diploma in Waldorf Education. And she's worked on documentaries before, but this is her first feature film. Wendy was inspired to pursue this documentary after hearing about complications from a friend but it was Robert Whitaker's book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, that really made her aware of this growing problem. Now, Bob is featured in the film. He was also featured on my podcast, EarthRise number 91, because he's been a big influence on my work and understanding of this problem. So go back 2 episodes if you want to hear that. I highly recommend it. Bob runs madinamerica.com, which is my go-to resource for any time I want to get an insider's look in what's going on in psychiatry and pharmacology today. I won't give too much more background, as these two women explain the problems quite well, and I highly recommend the film. It's both startling and enlightening at the same time. And there are links to the documentary in the show notes. But check out medicatingnormal.com and see a screening of this important work. What I also like about their website is how many resources they post on it. So you'll have plenty to work from just by going to their website. But again, see the documentary. It's not only Angela's story that's being told. I think there's 4 or 5 different people they follow around the country over the course of a number of years. And watching how people try to recover from benzodiazepines and antidepressants is again pretty eye-opening. Now, with roughly 1/5 of the American population taking an SSRI, SNRI, or benzodiazepine right now, the stakes are too high to ignore this problem. Enjoy the podcast and our film, and make sure to check out derekbarris.substack.com, which is my weekly newsletter that you can subscribe to either at the free level or the paid level. Every Monday morning, I send out an episode or an issue dealing with different mental health treatments, different problems and solutions in psychiatry and mental health, as well as physical health. And even today's was societal health, because health isn't just one thing. We both need to be in alignment with our community and our environment, as well as with ourselves, to optimize our health overall. Okay, thanks everyone. Enjoy the podcast. Well, congratulations on the film. It's very important and powerful at this moment. So I really appreciated watching it. And the messages that it got across. And I would just like to start with a big picture question of what inspired the documentary in the first place.
Okay, well, I'll answer that as the director. We actually have 2 directors, myself and Lynn Cunningham. And Lynn has a family member who has been on psychiatric medications for many years, and over the years accumulated a number of diagnoses, schizoaffective and all sorts of diagnoses. And when Lynn looked back about 15 years ago when this started, her family member was a recent Harvard graduate, was working, was an athlete. And now, after 15 years of psychiatric treatment, she is on disability. She can't work. She has very poor health. And she is not doing well mentally. So Lynn started to question, well, if this treatment helps people, why am I seeing her deteriorate over time? And why is there this sort of constant changing cocktail of medications, so that every few years the list is a little bit different and diagnoses are added and diagnoses are taken away? And then Lynn found the book Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker, and that really lays out the problem with these psychiatric medications, and that they're actually causing an epidemic of disability from the side effects, essentially, of these psychotropic drugs. So when we read this book, she said, this is such a big issue. We both agreed it was worthy of making a documentary. So we did.
Yeah, that book is, I had Bob Whitaker on my podcast a few weeks ago, actually, and his book, I'm working on a book on psychedelic therapy right now. And you can't really talk about why psychedelics can be potentially helpful for mental health unless you address why current mental health protocols are not working. And also understanding what mental health is. And Angela, I know in the film, you go through your struggle about just understanding what mental health is. And when was the moment that it sort of clicked for you that all this cocktail of drugs you were on just wasn't serving you, and how were you able to taper off of that?
Well, I think it was tricky because I was on, at one point in 2006, I was on 18 at the same time. And I think that took away my ability to even know there was anything wrong with that. Like,
Yeah.
I lost part of that judgment. So I was just lucky at that time to meet a psychiatrist who said, I'm a psychiatrist who doesn't believe in psychiatry. And he said, he took me off of 10 overnight, which was not a pleasant experience at all. So then I started to get a little better, but my waking up process took probably 10 years, where it was like, I wonder, there's little questions that would just creep in. Like, I wonder who I am without all these meds. I wonder who I am beneath all this, and like, what are my feelings and what are side effects, or like, how do I even feel about the war? Why? And I would just have little things like, why don't I feel like I'm a part of the world? Like, I always felt like there was this bubble, and I was like, I was behind this glass and I was watching all my friends have fun and get married and have children. And I was stuck at home eating potato chips, like wondering why I'm so sad if I'm taking all these meds. So it was just, all these questions started to come. And then I just slowly, I don't even think I was consciously aware that I wanted to get off of everything. It was more of like a harm reduction, not even like on purpose. Just like, I would just tell the doctor, can I come off of this one and see how I feel? And they would say yes. And then maybe I would change providers and get somebody else. And then I'd be like, I don't really feel like this is working, and like I said in the film, like I would go up to the highest dose and then come down and just say like, I don't want to take this anymore. But finally that last drug was the benzodiazepine. It almost killed me coming off of that. I don't know. So it was just like a very slow intuition almost was telling me like, something is wrong. There's something more. What you're doing right now is not working for you.
And how long has it been since you've been on any of the drugs?
I'm 4.5 years off of everything. Yeah.
Do you feel that the you that you remember before starting the cocktail, has that returned, or do you feel that you're just different in some capacity overall?
I do feel parts of my old self coming back. Like, I was really adventurous, fun-loving, silly, goofy. Like, those things are coming back. But I mean, I know everybody wants to hear this like hero's journey that like, oh, all these things are magic now and you're perfectly healed and you don't have to do any work. But what I know is that taking all the medications, seeking all these treatment while on medication really just kicked the can down the road and kind of left me like, now you still have trauma. Now you still have to deal with it. Now you might have to reprocess it. But then the added trauma of like 15 years of my life were, as a patient, completely invested in the system that I thought was going to help me, but it kind of derailed my healing capabilities that I could have had on my own, So I feel pretty like distrustful of the mental health care system. I feel like a little victimized by it, honestly. And just the amount of medications in my brain over that many years has changed me on a neurological, physiological basis to where like things don't work the way that they used to work.
When you started this, well, first off, how did you pick the subjects in the film, Wendy? And we could start with Angela and then talking about the other people who are featured in the film, the patients first.
Sure. And do you hear us okay? We're just talking into the computer.
No, it sounds good. Yeah.
Okay. And we were trying to get the noise from the background away. So yeah, when we started this film, we interviewed like over 100 people. We put out a post on Facebook saying we were looking for people that had wanted to talk about their experience with psychiatric medications. And we got hundreds of people contacted us, and then we emailed them, and then we split it into two groups. And I would say each Lynn and I did 1 hour or more phone conversations with like at least 50 people each. And then some of them we went to meet them, and it was all, in a way, it was looking for who we were going to put in our film. But I realize now a lot of it was also, we were educating ourselves through people's stories. We also read many books and talked to many experts. Sorry, we have a dog here. Angie,
my cat is sleeping right behind one of my cats, so it might happen to me too.
So I learned a lot talking to all these people. It's different from what you read in the books and what you hear from the experts, because it was hearing people's actual experiences on medications, trying to get off medication, all of that. And then through the course of that, we sort of ended up, it just came together. There was 4 or 5 people there was 4 people whose story we started to follow. And I met Angie and the other people, and we sort of chose them. I don't know how we wanted some geographical diversity. We wanted some age diversity. And
yeah, I noticed that you went across the country, and then there was also that retreat where I know, Angela, you won the award for most fucks, was it? I think that was so.
That word.
So some of yourself has to have come back, which was nice to see. But your involvement, I mean, you're also, when I reached out about doing this interview, you're involved in the film beyond just being in it. So what interested you about taking on that role in doing social media and other aspects of the film?
I think it's been really healing for me to be able to talk about this experience out in the open with people that may not know about it. And I had went to social work school thinking I wanted to be a therapist. And when I got in the trenches, I was like, I don't want to do this. So I thought, like, I just want to talk about this as much as I can. And I think I asked Wendy, like, do you care? Can we do some screenings? Like, can I go do some screenings? And she was like, of course, like, let's go do it. So I sold everything I own just about and bought an RV and moved in the RV and started traveling the country doing screenings. And I feel like this is what I'm supposed to do right now, you know.
What was it about being a therapist that you didn't think that would appeal?
Well, it was things like when somebody's really suicidal, I want to talk with them and be with them and not have to cut myself off at an hour or have to call a psychiatrist or have to put them in a psych ward. There's these ethical things that as a therapist you have to do, and I don't want to have to do anything besides be with a person, you know.
Yeah, I spent 2 years as a patient monitor of suicidal patients in a hospital, and it's tough. It's a tough situation, especially when they're on a lot of tranquilizers, which they inevitably are, just to keep them sedated. And it's very emotionally challenging. What would you say have you learned, and this is through your research, and this is open to both of you. We can start with Wendy. What was the most eye-opening aspects about the pharmaceutical industry and how they operate that you discovered during your research?
Oh, wow, that is a big question, because although I had been skeptical of conventional medicine in a certain way for most of my life, not that I completely rejected it, but I was shocked when I really started reading books and getting into the details. So, for example, I'm totally shocked at the FDA process that medications that are designed to be taken for many, many years or for people's lifetimes, to get them approved, they really just have to show that they work better than a placebo over 3 to 6 weeks, that there is no obligation to test these drugs for long-term side effects. I was also extremely shocked to discover that pharmaceutical companies pay for most of the research on their own drugs, so that 90% of medical research is funded by pharmaceutical companies, and they are actually not stupid. So they design the research basically to get the result that they want, and they run trials, and when they don't like the result, they throw out that trial and they design a new trial a little bit differently. And that this is what is called the evidence base of medicine. So, I mean, I don't even know, there is so much I could say about the pharmaceutical industry. Another thing I was actually very shocked about that many people don't know is that most of the nonprofit patient advocacy groups, you know, everything from like anti-suicide groups to bipolar support alliance, receive over 80% of their funding from pharmaceutical companies, have pharma people, marketing people on their boards, and are basically there to create a narrative in our society that there is all this problem with these diseases, whether it's mental health or they do the same thing for other diseases, and thus to create more demand for the product of the pharmaceutical companies. Yeah.
Right. I just actually wrote up that report this week for the research article in the Journal of Bioethics about 67% of advocacy groups being funded by pharmaceuticals, the number they came up with. And that's obviously really disturbing on a number of levels. Angela, what did you learn specific to how these pharmaceutical industries act that you didn't know when you were going through all of those experiences you had?
I mean, I think when I came off the last drug, it was a benzodiazepine, and there was like a period of like 2 months where I was reading everything I could get my hands on, trying to make sense of why I felt so terrible, because I didn't know that there was withdrawal symptoms. Like, just that was like news to me. Even with a psychology degree, we didn't talk about withdrawal symptoms from psychiatric drugs. So I just started reading things, and I read Anatomy of an Epidemic, and I just, all the long-term outcomes, you die 25 years early. Just when I was just learning about the actual long-term effects from the drugs that I had been on, it was like my head was blowing up. Like, wait a minute, I mean that maybe I wasn't ever mentally ill in the first place. Like, I've been lied to. Like, all these research that they claim that it's so safe and effective is just all BS. So it was just this like mind blown like thing that happened to me.
Yeah, I'm actually reading this book right now. It's A Brief History of Madness by an amazing historian, Roy Porter, but it goes through about 4,000 years worth of our ideas of constitutes good mental health, and then treatment protocols and how that's shifted over the years. Looking back on it now, what do you think would have been the most effective treatment for you when you began going on to these drugs?
I just wish, I said it in the film, that I was just a scared little girl that just came out of a war zone. And I think if I had a chaplain or a friend or someone to talk to me to say, like, what you're feeling right now is completely normal. You were around people shooting at you, and, mortars and noise and smoke, and not having a shower for 4 months, and like environmental stress and, panic and all this, that just the way that your nervous system is feeling right now is normal for leaving a war zone. There's nothing wrong with you, but the other aspect is like being taken away from your unit, from the people that you had this like intense experience with, and being shipped back to Germany. And then a week later, I'm in the United States. Like, just that transition is rough. So I almost wish they would have left me there to recover, like with my other troops or something like that, just the way that we bring home people from war is just not, and then you put them on drugs and then tell them they're mentally ill for the rest of their life. It's not even, I don't know. It's just a crazy system that we have.
Well, actually, I read that you are working on an initiative to help to educate the military about that process of putting soldiers on drugs. Can you talk a little about that and what you're doing with it?
Well, last year I did a fellowship with the VFW, Veterans of Foreign Wars, and it was a legislative policy fellowship we got to each pick our own issue. So my issue was benzodiazepines and over-medication of military veterans. And so what I did was I did a bunch of research on benzos and pulled like everything I could find about veterans and benzodiazepines. And what I found was that veterans that have any exposure to benzos, even in the short term, it increases their likelihood of suicide by 2.5 times. And we have this epidemic of suicide right now in our community that's 20 to 22 veterans a day die by suicide. But the one question nobody is asking is what is the role of medication and over-medication in these people that are dying? So I'm trying to bring attention to that whatever way I can. The film helps me do that with, we show it and then we talk about it. I'm no longer in school. I'm no longer in a fellowship. So I'm doing what I can and looking for any opportunity there is to talk about it. That's what I want to do.
Have you looked into any of the research on MDMA trials that are showing efficacy for that very issue?
A little bit. I saw the trauma conference with Bessel van der Kolk, and they were talking about it intensely.
Yeah. I have your email. I'll send it to you, but MAPS is doing that work, and they've done some up in Massachusetts that's showing very good results. So that might be something to find, because they're moving to phase 3 right now, which is great news.
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that Bob Whitaker writes about in the book is that the chemical imbalance theory of mental illness is that these drugs are actually what creates the chemical imbalance. And I would also argue that the environment creates the chemical imbalance because it creates the social conditions that leave people anxious and stressed and depressed. But he also discusses, and he mentions this in the movie, he mentioned it to me, and it's fascinating how Xanax actually became legal, about Upjohn doing the 4-week results, but then dismissing the 8 and 14-week results, which were not in its favor. And that was in 1980. 2017, there were 25 million prescriptions for Xanax that were written. And I was on Xanax for a short period of time because I had severe anxiety disorder and panic attacks. But I used it as recommended, meaning I did 1 or 2 a week for a few weeks and then got off of it. So I kind of consider myself lucky in that sense. But looking back at that time and looking at all this research now, why do you think that more people are not aware of these issues with these substances?
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, I feel there's kind of at least 2 threads. So on the one side is we can blame it on the pharmaceutical companies, their marketing of these drugs, their systematic misinforming of doctors. So when doctors go to medical school, I think they are intentionally taught not to look at risks of drugs, not to look at side effects, to kind of ignore, there are guidelines that benzos shouldn't be prescribed long-term, and yet doctors are doing it all the time. They're clearly overprescribed. Everybody who shows up in the emergency room is offered an Ativan, or usually Ativan, I think, or Xanax. So there's pharmaceutical marketing, which has distorted the evidence base of medicine and infiltrated the medical schools so that these drugs are being pushed on people. But then I think there probably is a cultural context also where people have the idea that any problem you have, there should and probably is a fix, and that medicine, we're taught to go to doctors for that fix. And it's hard for us to hear that there's a lot of things in life which suck, and there's nothing that can easily fix it in the short term. And, people sometimes interpret that as, well, are you just saying that everybody just has to suck it up? It's like, no, but there just isn't a cure for many things in a pill. But I think there are other ways that are longer and harder, and sometimes it is just carrying pain and living with pain. But as I said, I think our culture doesn't support that. So doctors will often say, well, patients come to me asking for drugs. And I think there's some reality to that also.
Well, direct-to-consumer advertising.
Yes.
Ask your doctor about blah, blah, blah,
Yeah, the advertising, but it falls on a fertile ground where people want to be able to fix everything. And I think there's even a culture that we need to be highly functional and performative, and you can't take time off to just kind of be depressed for a few weeks or... Yeah.
One question I have is something that comes up in your film is informed consent. And that's something that is ever rarely talked about in this industry. I remember when I went to my general practitioner with my anxiety problems, it was just, here's Xanax, use it as you will. And that's pretty much all I got. So what do you think it will take to get informed consent more prevalent in the psychiatry industry?
Well, the question that the court case in the beginning of the film was actually a hearing put forward by a patient group, a real patient advocacy group, not a pharma-funded one, that was pushing for informed consent before benzodiazepines are prescribed. And I believe similar pushes have happened in other states where people have found that somebody sponsors a bill that would require that people be informed of the dangers of these drugs if taken long term before they're given the prescription. However, that did not pass even in the Massachusetts legislature, and that is due to, we don't know exactly, but probably due to pharmaceutical industry lobbying with politicians, and even to the American Psychiatry Association and to psychiatrist guild, whether it's the Massachusetts Psychiatry Group, because it does appear that the psychiatrists groups, whether this is pharma money influencing them or if it just truly comes out of themselves, really a little bit like the NRA. You know how the NRA doesn't want any restrictions whatsoever on any firearms. And it's pretty much the same from what we've seen in the psychiatry world. I can't speak for all the other drugs, that they seem to, psychiatrists, lobbying groups themselves seem to feel that if informed consent is required for benzodiazepines, that impedes their freedom to prescribe and what will be next. Because I don't understand why that wouldn't be the case. It seems like it would be an obvious thing, and that doctors would want to do this.
And one thing from the
but they don't.
Yeah. And one from the patient standpoint is, I read the pamphlet, and it says things like you might be dizzy or lightheaded, but first of all, the drug company is downplaying like the severity of what that's really going to be like. So how can you give true informed consent when the packet doesn't even explicitly state like what could possibly happen, and how do they even know what's going to happen long term, because they can't study that before long term. You know what I'm saying? Like, they're studying what they need to study to get it out in the market, not what's going to happen long term. So from a patient standpoint, I thought dizziness meant I'll just need to get up slowly, but the dizziness that I experienced coming off of antidepressants and benzodiazepines was like, I can't walk. Like, I'm walking on the Grand Canyon in high heels on a tight wire. Like, that was the level of disability from it. So yeah, the actually one of the things we learned is that if you Google the FDA label for your drug, you will see certain side effects. You might see warnings about withdrawal. That's not exactly informed consent, but if you want to find out, you can. However, it really varies. With the older drugs that have had more lawsuits, have a lot more side effects on them, because side effects are put on that official FDA label that is consultable, usually as a result of lawsuits. And when a new drug comes out, it will often have very few side effects. And that's simply because there haven't been lawsuits yet. And pharmaceutical companies use that as a marketing ploy. They will say, well, we have a new antidepressant that seems to have less side effects than the older ones. And that gets the doctors to prescribe their new patented and more expensive drug instead of a generic. And then as the years pass, there are lawsuits, and they are forced to put more side effects on the label. And of course, once a side effect is on the label, you actually can't sue for that anymore. But the question of sort of official informed consent, how can anybody know? Like, if you would have tried to tell me your life is going to be completely derailed, you'll lose your marriage, you'll lose your career, are you sure you want to still take this? And 15 years down the line, you'll wake up and say, what the hell happened to my life? Yeah. Could anybody have warned me of that? No.
The organization that's sponsoring the screening of your film tomorrow, the online screening, found my article this week about the research article that I was talking about earlier, and they shared it, and that created an interesting conversation. I know I tagged you on part of that. That's how I found out about the screening. But one woman who runs a benzodiazepine recovery organization, it looks like, she took contention with one part of my article, which I understand from a big picture view. I don't know if I agree with it pharmacologically, where she says you can't actually get addicted to benzodiazepines because of informed consent. And I wonder, if in your view, Angela, that you were addicted to any of these drugs. Like, would you
No,
consider it that?
no, because there's a huge difference between being addicted and being physiologically dependent. First of all, I was taking the drugs exactly as prescribed. To me, the difference between addiction and dependence is, am I craving the drug? Am I doing something despite the consequences to get the drug? Like, am I standing on the corner trying to buy Xanax? No, I did not do anything like that. I did not, in fact, I didn't want to be on the drug. Like, I was actively tapering to come off. Now, do both people with addiction problems and physiological dependence experience withdrawal symptoms? Yes, but the behavior behind it is different. And I think the contention is, we don't want to be lumped in because of our current medical system's view of addicts, which they use it as a slur, like these horrible people that, you know, they're doing it to themselves or something. The treatment of people with addiction is just different than people with treatment of being physiologically dependent on a drug that you're trying to get off of.
Yeah, understood. And I would say that I don't think in most any case with addiction, I think of it more of the neurological or physiological dependence, not someone who just wants to get high, right? I think that because I have a lot of friends who work in addiction recovery, and that's why I brought up that question, because I think that from my perspective, the idea of addiction is that if you do not get it, you're going to have negative physiological symptoms.
Well, the same is for dependency. So I mean, the difference I think is, are you taking more than you're prescribed? Are you trying to get more and actively, and maybe you have craving? I never craved or tried to get any, I'm trying to get off of it.
Mm-hmm. Understood.
We learned this making the film, that in the community of people who have been harmed by psychiatric medication, they the word addiction they don't like because they feel it's stigmatizing, and they draw the distinction between dependence and addiction. And we actually have, I think, a video on our YouTube channel with Anna Lemke of Stanford, who's an addiction medicine specialist. And she talks about that difference too. Even in medicine, I guess they do recognize a difference between addiction and dependence, prescribed drug dependence, although, you know.
Yeah, it's been a personal topic just because I've had close people to me get addicted or dependent on opioids, like family members and close friends. So it's, you know, I understand the bigger picture view. And it is because addiction, my view, I mean, I think Portugal is one of the greatest examples of, you know, when they decriminalized all drugs, the number of people using drugs went drastically down. And part of that was just because of the fact that they started treating addiction differently. It wasn't a slur, as you said. It was the recognition that all of these chemicals are doing damaging things to our brain and our bodies, and that we should recognize that and try a tapering process with everyone. But I think that's an important discussion. So thank you for clarifying the mindset of that.
Yeah.
Now,
I think opiates is really interesting when you think that we do use the word addiction a lot. And in general, there is the idea that somebody who only took opiates as prescribed and then had a really hard time coming off, well, he's maybe okay. But somebody who took opiates and then at a certain point found they needed more and couldn't get a prescription and had to go out and get them otherwise, well, he's a bad person because he was an addict.
Yeah.
But yet he was probably experiencing unbearable withdrawal symptoms in between his doses, and really did the only thing he felt he could do to cope, which was to get more of this drug that the doctor had been prescribing him.
Absolutely.
Very good point. Now, you are going up against some of the wealthiest industry, one of the wealthiest industries in the world. And I wonder if you've gotten any pushback from the film, or Angela, from you going out and speaking on these topics.
Well, not from the industry yet. I think they just ignore us, but certainly in screenings, we do have people who, you know, say, well, these drugs worked for me. And usually people are really somewhat nuanced about that. Even people who say, well, I'm taking an antidepressant and I think it's helped me, they often, you know, have a thoughtful view, and they do seem to be quite open to the idea that these drugs don't help everybody. The very few times that someone has been kind of a little bit angry it's usually a parent whose child is on medication, and they will say, my daughter really needs these drugs, and I wouldn't want her to see this film because she might go off them. And I've heard that once or twice. Interestingly enough, I've never had a really mentally ill person on multiple drugs come up and say they didn't like the film. I have had people who are on a number of drugs and who seem to have very serious diagnoses actually come up to me after the film and say, that was really interesting, I liked it, but I'm on 5 drugs. But usually they seem more thoughtful, not angry. But the parent is usually the family member, usually talking about somebody else really needing the drug, which is interesting to me, but that's the main pushback we've gotten.
Okay. How about you, Angela? Have you received any?
I mean, this topic is so personal to me. I would say my point of pushback is always when people say like, well, some people really need these drugs, or some people, and I don't know, but I just take it really personal. Like, yeah, well, that might be true, but there's some people that are really, really harmed by drugs, and we're not talking about that, and we need to talk about that. So sometimes I can just feel defensive comments, even like doctors maybe like, well, I don't, my patients need meds, or stuff like that feels like it's a defense to me, rather than like see the validity of there's these stories out there that aren't getting told. It's kind of like, well, wait, my paycheck depends on me not knowing this kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, ongoing education is unfortunately rare in the medical industry. I had to, when my doctor wanted to put me on a statin because I have genetic high cholesterol, I had to inform her about how the American Heart Association said that high cholesterol is not an indicator for heart disease, as they found out in 2017, and she hadn't known that. And it seems like that's an ongoing problem. Certain doctors are wonderful in that sense with ongoing education, but a lot of them aren't. They kind of get in their habitual patterns of prescription, and then that's what they rely on, and that's all that they know. Big picture, what do you think will help to change? Do you see some light at the end of this tunnel with psychiatry and general practitioners starting to take this more seriously? Like, have you encountered doctors as you're doing screenings that are really rethinking their patterns of treatment?
Yeah, this is a really interesting story. I had a prescriber in Asheville, North Carolina come to one of the screenings, and we had actually taken her out to lunch, and she was completely naive to any of the topics in the film. And we just got to talking, and I was listening to her, and it was like, she's just a traditional prescriber. She sees her patients, she gives them meds, and they go away and they come back next month, that kind of thing. Well, after our talks and after the screening, she had a patient come in the week after and say, well, I was put in the hospital, they put me on all these meds, and I was really suicidal, and they took me off my meds, and then they put me on these other ones. And then she asked the one simple question: do you think the medication changes might have caused your suicidality? And he said yes. And she said, before seeing this film, I would have never asked that question. It wasn't even a thought. Like, the way that the thinking is that any symptom that you have is because of your mental illness. It's not, it could be because of the medication. So things like that happen all the time. Even veterans, when I've showed it to veterans, I had a spouse say, oh my God, now this opens an avenue of hope, where my husband was getting worse, but I thought his treatment should be working, and so why is he getting worse? But now I think, oh my gosh, maybe he could get better if we could take him off some of these meds. So I see it as like a patient to patient, or it's just one person at a time kind of changing to happen.
Yeah, or a documentary that people see, which will help, hopefully. Wendy, how did you go about picking the experts in the film? We talk about the subjects, but we know Bob Whitaker, obviously, but some of the other experts.
We read about 20 books, and we interviewed a lot of experts on the phone, and we just ended up, choosing. We interviewed a couple of experts we didn't use in the film, because then the tough thing was the experts said so many interesting things that we couldn't fit into the film. So we then had to sort of just fit in the pieces that kind of didn't break up the narrative too much. So we have the outtakes, a lot of clips from the experts on our YouTube channel. For example, Anna Lemke of Stanford talking about tolerance. as a normal and expectable phenomenon with any psychoactive drug, by which you're going to need higher and higher doses, tolerance and withdrawal, she talks about. So yeah, there's a number of people doing interesting work and have interesting things to say. They're not widely enough known or listened to. But.
Right. And that's one of the things I found is the disclaimer on your website. Your website is a wonderful resource as well, besides the film and the people in it, but actually linking to articles and topics of discussion. But the disclaimer that you're not affiliated with Scientology. Did you actually, were people asking about that, or did you just have the foresight to point that out?
Yeah, I don't know if some people say, oh, you shouldn't have put that on. I guess, yeah, we did hear that a little bit. I think it was stronger probably 10 years ago that Scientologists really don't like psych drugs. And that accusation has been used again. I know some people like Bob Whitaker, and I know a couple other activists people have occasionally tried to discredit them by saying they're Scientologists.
I think that's just a defense that we bring the education and awareness around these topics. The easiest thing to say is that instead of actually investigate kind of what we're saying and the people that share their stories in the film. It's just easier to say that.
Yeah. Well, I also wondered because one of the people in the film is Kelly Brogan. And when you listen to her in the film, everything she says is great. And that's actually how I first found out about her work a while ago, was through that lens. But more recently, she's been posting about how face masks are a psyop and that people shouldn't wear them, and that public health is that we should just abandon the public health model and listen to the wisdom of our bodies. Right now, I think about a couple of years ago when I had cancer, if I didn't have my oncologist and the therapeutics, then my body isn't that wise, right? We still need healthcare, obviously. So I wonder if when we have people like that affiliated, if that's going to be detrimental, because while everything in the film checks up, when you go and you look at her specifically, because everyone else I've followed their work and it's solid, but if there's going to be any pushback on that aspect.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. The team, we have definitely been talking about that lately. Kelly has had an evolution. When we actually first met her and interviewed her, she was way more conservative than she is now. And she'd only just stopped prescribing, like a year or two earlier. And it's actually really interesting to hear about her evolution because, she was trained at MIT. She was a traditional psychiatrist who specialized in prescribing to pregnant women. And then she sort of had an awakening when she became depressed herself and was pregnant and realized she didn't want to take these drugs. And that sort of sent her on a journey, first of all, reading the research and questioning all the drugs, and that later got her into looking at what are the alternatives. And now, yes, I would say she's gone very far into the alternatives. And she was not that far into that when we put her in the film. And I agree, some of her work now, some of the things she says now have become a distraction. And certainly I know there are people in this movement like Bob Whitaker who is very disappointed because she was a very powerful and articulate voice, and one of the few, there's not that many psychiatrists who are willing to speak out and who are able to speak out, who are articulate and beautiful and good writers. So she was much appreciated, and now people feel that she's a little bit discrediting this what they call themselves the critical psychiatry movement, not anti-psychiatry, but critical. She's discrediting that with her current